All right, everyone. Welcome to the space. Good evening or good morning. I know a lot of y'all from different time zones are joining us here. So, if y'all could do me a favor and just retweet the link or tweet out the link to this space. We want to get a lot of people in here and have a really collaborative discussion for the Q&A portion. But I know I held a space on Iran, after the missile attacks in Erbil. And I remember, Dr. Anas had joined. And after, him kind of coming onto the space, talking about, the ramifications of this on the oil markets and, some other things related to oil. I was bombarded with DMs of people asking me to bring him on for, kind of to go over some questions and some of the questions that we're going to be tackling tonight. I think there's a lot of people in the world right now, they're seeing what's happening in Iran, they're seeing what's happening in Russia, in Ukraine, and they're curious on the short-term impact of these things, the long-term impact, and kind of how this impacts them personally. So we're going to be going through a whole host of these questions, and I can't think of anybody better than Dr. Anas to have on here to help us out with them. So I want to do a quick introduction, kind of give a little bit of insight on his background, and then give the mic over to him for some general comments, and then we're going to jump right into this thing. So bear with me for one moment. Dr. Nasi is somebody that's pretty well versed in the economic side of what we're going to be talking about today. He has both an undergrad and a PhD in economics. He's a former chief economist at Energy Capital Management. He's actually, authored several articles that have, they're excellent reads, and he's been a moderator for the OGEL. Currently, he's a managing partner at Energy Outlook Advisors, and tonight he's our keynote speaker. So, we're really happy to have him. And with that being said, Doctor, I'll give the mic off to you and, make some general comments, and we'll get this thing rolling.
Thank you very much. Let's start with Iran, because I think if we understand the history of the oil industry of Iran, we understand a lot of things now. So the first question is, have Iranian oil exports ever been completely blocked by another nation? As you know, we have sanctions being imposed on Iran several times, and those sanctions failed. And the question is, have Iranian oil been blocked before? And the second question is, has the U.S. succeeded in the past in changing the regime in Tehran? As you know, because of the opposition to the current regime and the attempts basically to modify it or change it or have some changes in the attitude, etc. So the question is, has the U.S. succeeded in the past in changing the regime in Tehran? To answer those questions, we need to go through quickly through the oil history of Iran. Iran in the past, Iran is a new name. It used to be called Persia. And the change happened in 1935. So this is a relatively recent change. In 1901, exploration for oil started in Iran. A guy with the name of William D'Arcy was granted a 60-year concession in exchange for 20,000 sterling in cash and another 20,000 sterling in the company they are establishing, and 16% of net profit and royalties. And at that time, the Pahlavi dynasty was not there. We know about the Shah of Iran. His father was a kind of a military officer, and Persia basically had a leader at that time who signed this concession. Now listen to this. The concession included all of Persia at that time, except 5 provinces bordering Russia. Remember those 5 provinces, because we are going to talk about them a few times as we talk about the history of the oil industry. They couldn't find oil. For several years, they tried and tried and tried, and they couldn't find anything. Finally, D'Arcy gave up. He sold his company and his shares to a British company called the British Burma Oil Company. Now, the British has a system, and that system basically says that everything in the East is controlled by the East. So that's why the British Burma Oil Company came to play. They did invest some money. They did not get anything. And they decided to leave. At the 11th hour, when they decided to leave, oil was discovered on May 26, 1908, in Masjid Sulaiman. Now, this is there is a very strange coincidence here, that oil was discovered at the 11th hour in massive quantities in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, and in Oman. In all cases, the company literally decided to leave. And by the time whatever they sent, the message they sent, by the time the message arrived, oil was discovered. So that's the same case for Saudi Arabia and Oman. So now oil is discovered, and there were a lot of changes going on around the world. This Burma Oil Company now formed a new company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or APOC. And it was a public company to manage the concession in Iran. And of course, the oil contract still valid. So the Iranian or the Persian government at that time will get whatever was agreed to at that time, including the 16% royalty and profit. Now, strangely enough, I'm going to tell you this in advance. This Anglo-Persian Oil Company is BP now. So this is kind of one of the ironies, is that the British oil company is originally from Persia. But a lot of things been going on at that time. And so the discovery happened in 1908. The British Navy decided to switch to oil, from coal to oil, in 1912. Now, this is very important to notice the dates here. The British came in late to the game because the Germans and others were switching to oil, because when it comes to the Navy, speed matters. In those wars, speed matters. All of this is just before World War I. Now, here is the reason why the British came in late and they did not move really fast to oil, because they want to protect the coal industry. Remember, just recently, when Trump was a president of the United States, was trying to protect the coal industry too. But who was the head of the Navy at that time? The head of the Navy was Winston Churchill. So now I want you to remember two things here. I want you to remember the 5 provinces that border Russia, and I want you to remember the name of Winston Churchill. Now, we already know that this company in Persia basically is BP now. I just want to mention something quick here. As you know, BP decided to leave Russia. How BP got into Russia? They formed a company called TNK BP in 2003, and they were very successful. Putin and his cronies did not like it. They give them hard time. They decided literally to force BP out. The situation got so bad that the CEO of the company, the British CEO of the company, fled Russia in 2008. Who is that CEO of that company? Is Bob Dudley, who is the head of BP right now, who is leaving Russia now. So those coincidences are going to play a lot. We are going to see them a lot as we go through this quick history. So now the British Navy switched. We are talking about World War I, and all of a sudden someone is saying, oh, oil is really a national security matter. We cannot leave it to private sector. We cannot leave it to the Persian. We cannot leave it this. And the British government decided to purchase what is now BP, and purchase 51% shares, so it will have the controlling shares. So the Anglo-Persian Oil Company now is 51% owned by the British government. That's going to play a very significant role in the events that follow, because now it's a vital interest to the British but it is inside Persia. Now, Churchill, we are in the 1920s. Churchill is a private citizen. And the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1923 hired Churchill as a consultant to lobby the British government to extend the concession to the rest of Persia. Remember those 5 provinces near Russia, on the border of Russia? Now they want to extend the concession to them. So they used Churchill to lobby the government to extend the concession, and he was very successful. In 1933, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company concession was renegotiated, and they started a new 60-year contract. The problem is, this concession was so bad that all parties and the opposing parties in Iran and the religious leaders opposed that. And one of the reasons why, because that concession stripped Iran of any power to control its oil production. So the problem started from the 30s because they lost control of oil in Persia. In 1935, the name of the country changed from Persia to Iran. And the name of the company has to change because the name was the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Now it becomes the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Instead of APOC, now it is AIOC. Who changed the name, basically, is Reza Shah, the father of the Shah. As I told you, he was a military officer who took over the government, and he took over the country. And he tried to really develop the country. And he made a fatal mistake in doing so. After he changed the name, now he invited the Germans to build the railway system within Iran. And the Germans were very active. In 1941, World War II started, and now we have a problem. The Germans are in Persia on the border of the Soviet Union. And who is getting the oil out of Persia? The British. And the Soviet Union did not like the idea that the Germans have those railroads where they can literally bring military equipment and ammunition and other things from the Gulf all the way to the Soviet border. So what happened? The British and the Soviets decided to invade Iran. Why? Because Reza Shah refused to kick out the Germans. He really thought the German technology was the technology of the day, and he really wanted to use it, but he miscalculated. So when they asked him several times to force the Germans out, he refused. So what they did, they occupied the country. And the Soviets took those 5 provinces. Remember, I told you to remember those 5 provinces? So the Soviets took those 5 provinces, occupied them. The British took the rest of Iran. They put the Reza Shah in jail, and then they brought in his son, the 22-year-old son, Muhammad Pahlavi, who is the Shah we know. And he was appointed the Shah of Iran. In 1950, Iran was boiling. And there were many reasons for that. Of course, part of it is the spread of communism and the rise of the Tudeh party in Iran, in addition to the rise of the mullahs and other things going on around the world. But there was another secret that many books in history of oil missed. Now, oil was discovered in Bahrain, oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the Gulf. Here, I would like to mention the following. When the Americans started looking for oil in Saudi Arabia. The British were operating in Iran. So the Foreign Service Office asked the company to send geologists to the Gulf to see what the Americans are doing and whether there is oil or not. And those geologists determined with 100% certainty that there is no oil on the eastern flank of the Gulf. It's only on the western flank of the Gulf. It exists only in the east, in Iran. But when they saw the Americans very active, they asked them again. So they sent another group of geologists to the area. They went through parts of Oman, UAE, Saudi Arabia. And again, the British geologists said there is no oil in that part of the world. They missed the two largest oil fields in the world: the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia and the Burkhan field in Kuwait. So now, because of all this oil coming to the world, oil prices are down. Who was the loser? The main loser was Venezuela. The Venezuelans were very angry because they lost market share. And the reason why they lost market share, because they instituted a law and they forced the companies to pay 50% of profit. And they were able to kind of make royalties independent of that profit. So what happened is companies basically were reluctant to invest in Venezuela, and they decided to move to the Middle East because they pay less and make more money. The Venezuelans got angry, and they decided literally, and I looked at one of the documents, and the two words that I'm going to mention basically are very important in those documents. They decided to educate the Arabs and the Persians. That's what's said in the statement. They want to tell them, go for 50-50. So they sent a group of experts and high-level officials to Iran, and they educated the Iranians on the 50-50. And Mohammad Mossadegh, who became the prime minister in 1951, basically was highly influenced by what the Venezuelans told him, in addition to his own thinking, of course. So he decided to force the companies to do the same. But the companies refused. Later on, of course, the Venezuelans went to the Arab world, and they went to Cairo, and they participated in several meetings that led to the formation of OPEC. So the whole idea of Venezuelans participating in OPEC and coming to the Middle East is really to protect their own interest, nothing else. So now Mohammad Mossadegh is the prime minister. When the companies refused to go for 50-50 like the Venezuelans, he decided to nationalize the oil. Oil was nationalized. Now remember this. Today is March 17. Oil was nationalized on March 19. So in 2 days, we'll have the anniversary of the nationalization of oil in Iran. So oil was nationalized on March 19, 1951. What we see is the Shah basically just left the country. He went to Baghdad, and then he went to Rome. So now the prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, basically is running the country. But there were many developments that happened after that. Immediately after he nationalized the oil, he realized that he needed a company. So he established the current National Iranian Oil Company, the NIOC, that exists today, was founded by Mossadegh in 1951. But even he nationalized the oil, his objective really was to go for 50-50, but the companies refused even to talk to him. Immediately after this, the British claimed that this oil is theirs, and therefore he has no right to it, and this is stolen oil. And of course, the British workers, the engineers who were working for the company, they evacuated the whole country. Abadan refinery was the largest refinery in the world at that time. So the British left. And the British Navy and the British government decided, remember, they own 51% of the company. So this is a British government-owned thing. So they sent the British Navy, and they had a blockade of the Gulf. and any ship that was carrying the Iranian oil, they will board that ship and take over. Italy, because it was on the other side in the war, they tried to take the Iranian oil and they were literally met by force, and the British took over the Italian ships, and they blockaded the Iranian oil. So yes, the question is: was or has the Iranian oil been blocked ever completely? Yes, but they used force. Just having sanctions does not work. You need to use force to block it. That's the main lesson of this experiment. But there are other lessons too. Now, Mossadegh wants to run the business, but he has no engineers. He thought the Europeans are going to come into Iran and send engineers, and the Europeans refused to send engineers, and now he cannot even produce. That's a second lesson. You want to play hardball, you better be prepared. You better work on your universities and work on your education system and build those engineers. Everything I'm saying now is very important to the regime that we see today. And then he has another problem. He had no ships of his own to market his oil. He needed to use foreign ships, and foreign ships basically refused to carry his oil. That's another lesson. Why this is important? Because all those lessons were learned by the current regime. The current regime built its own basically education system where they have the engineers, they are Iranian engineers, and they bought their own ships because of the lessons they learned from the Mossadegh experiment. Um, on August 19, 1953, the CIA organized a military coup, and they kicked Mossadegh out, and they brought in the Shah back from Rome, and they reinstituted the Shah. The operation is very well known, called Operation Ajax, and the guy who was organizing it basically was the grandson of the former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. But his assistant, a young soldier, was one of my former bosses. When he was my boss, he was an old man. He had a PhD in nuclear physics, and he was just an amazing person. But he was the soldier who held Kermit Roosevelt in that coup. And there were a lot of things that cannot be said publicly. The U.S. provided several justifications for the military coup, and the most important one is very fascinating for today's events. The justification for the U.S. to involve the CIA and conduct the coup and reinstitute the Shah was the 5 provinces that I mentioned earlier. They said, look, those 5 provinces, because of the spread of communism in the country and because of the left-leaning Mohammad Mossadegh, etc., they really feared that they can lose those to the Soviet Union. So those 5 provinces continue to play a role in this case. In 1954, that Anglo-Iranian oil company formally becomes the British Petroleum Company, BP. So BP, as a name, was born in 1954, and again, it came out of Iran. I'm trying to wrap up here quickly. When the U.S. managed that coup, now remember the former company was owned 51% by the British, and the others basically private sector, etc. Now the Americans basically were able to come back to Iran. They told the British, look, you need to pay up, and you have to pay up by literally giving us shares in the new company. So this new company now has several American companies, but this is very interesting. You all know what Aramco is. Aramco was a partner in owning the Iranian oil, but it wasn't under the control of the Saudi government at that time. It was under the control of companies. Their name now is Chevron, Texaco, and ExxonMobil. So the four partners of Aramco at that time were Exxon, then Mobil, Texaco, and Chevron. Of course, they had different names at that time. But one of the clauses in this agreement is that it did not allow the Iranian government to control oil policy, nor to be on the board of directors, which means that they have full control of the Iranian oil industry. And this is one of the reasons that played later in the revolution, because as prices were rising, especially after the embargo of 1973, Iran was not making any extra money. All the other countries were making extra money, but Iran did not. And this is very kind of important point, because when the revolution happened in 1979, the Khomeini regime cut oil production from 6 million to 3 million. And the reason why they cut it, because engineers been pushing the Shah for a long time to cut production, because the Iranian fields basically were getting really exhausted and the pressure was going down, and they are going to basically have some serious problems. So now the Khomeini regime basically is in control of the industry. They did listen to the engineers, but here is the most interesting part. The revenues from the 3 million is way higher than the revenues from the 6 million during the Shah regime. So they were happy with it, and that's why there was no incentive to increase production after that. Mossadegh died in 1967. The Iranian Revolution, as you all know, happened in 1979, and the Shah was expelled. He tried to go to several places where his friends are. They refused him. He came in, tried to come to the United States. He couldn't. But then Carter allowed him, because he was sick and he needed treatment for his cancer, allowed him to come through the Mexican border to San Antonio. And the idea was no one will know, but everyone knew about it. And the regime in Iran got angry, and that's how they took over the embassy in Tehran at that time. After a few days, they forced the Shah to leave San Antonio, and he went back to Egypt, and he died in Egypt on July 1 in 1980. Also in 1980, on September 22nd, Saddam Hussein decided to attack Iran, and the Iraq-Iranian war started, and the war ended on August 20, 1988. The whole idea here is the following, that if you look at the history of Iran and you look at the oil market, the most influential country in the world on oil prices historically in terms of number of events and the magnitude was Iran, because of all the events that happened, whether the nationalization, etc., etc. And the nationalization was very important in the Arab world, because the success of Mossadegh in 1951 led to the success of the nationalization of Suez Canal, which plays a very important role in the oil and LNG business today, and the nationalization of oil in Iraq and other Arab countries, including Libya. So Iran was the most influential country in the oil business ever in terms of number of events and magnitude of events. But I will conclude with some lessons that we learned from this history, and I'll repeat one or two of them that I mentioned earlier, that blocking the oil exports of a country requires a strong navy that blocks the shipments. Otherwise, sanctions will not work. We already seen them not working in Iran, and did not work in Venezuela, and they will not work on Russia either. And strangling a regime requires the cooperation of other countries. And if Mossadegh was not able to have enough engineers, local engineers, that was a mistake. And he thought he can get them from somewhere else, but because of the cooperation of other countries and sticking together, basically he was not able to. So that was a big lesson there. Changing a regime needs people on the ground, and that's what happened in the 1953 coup. And let's remember another lesson, the biggest threat to any foreign investment is nationalism. Look at Russia today. So you see those historical lessons basically are applying to today's events. And again, one more time, you want to talk about nationalism and nationalization, you better build good universities so you can have good human resources. Otherwise, you will be in big trouble. So this is just kind of an overview of the history of the oil industry in Iran. And of course, you know what the sanctions did. The sanctions did not work. Iran was able to break the sanctions. They learned their lessons, and there are several games they are playing. Then the Chinese got involved, neighboring countries got involved, and they are exporting everything they can export. Xerxes, I'm done with this part.
Okay, yeah, I want to get to the first question we have. So, yeah, I want to ask, how will the oil market react to a new nuclear deal with Iran? We're looking at the nuclear deal right now. It's on the 5 yard line. There's really a small number of issues left that need to be handled. Iran is a country, obviously, with the second largest natural gas reserves, the fourth largest oil reserves. So they have the potential to be a big player in this industry. So I want to get your thoughts on that. How will the oil market react to a new nuclear deal with Iran?
If Russia did not invade Ukraine and we have a nuclear deal, the impact is very limited, and is very limited to some speculation, couple of dollars, $3 probably for a few days, and that's it. And the reason why, because Iranian oil is already in the market no matter what. So since it's already there, in the short run, there is no impact. Although we learned from previous instances that the Iranian government might store oil. I'm not talking about the floating storage they already have. I'm talking about this is a completely different game. They store some crude, and then on the day where they sign the agreement, they release that crude. The idea here is they want to show the success of the deal to the Iranian people on one side, and they want to show the other partners that there is a fruit to reap in this case, and they want to show the rest of the world, yes, we can increase production. But that's it. But over the medium term and the long term, they can increase production meaningfully. They can add another 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day, probably within 2 years. They can have the first increase probably within 6 to 7 months. But the idea here is its impact on the market is very limited anyway, because demand is increasing, the market is tight, and we do need the Iranian oil today. We need it in the medium term. We need it in the long term, simply because of the increasing demand. So its impact on lowering prices is very limited, and we need it to stabilize the market no matter what. But because of the Russian-Ukraine situation, we have a panic in the market. And in a panic, fundamentals have no role. Anything could happen. So if we end up with an agreement with Iran, we may not see the impact at all, because it is embedded in the impact of that panic. So there could be an impact, but we may not be able to see it because of that panic. But in general, the impact is very limited.
So let me challenge that real quick and see what you think about this. So I think a lot of people see right now the problem with OPEC Plus is spare capacity, right? Some experts say that Iran right now they have a really large inventory, and in 6 to 8 months, like they have the potential to replace Russian oil that falls off the market. You don't think that this has any impact, like with the Iran store of their inventories, along with the lack of capacity from OPEC Plus members? You don't think this could change the market?
Okay, let's settle this once and for all. If we lose all the Russian oil, there is no replacement. And if we lose all the Russian natural gas, there is no replacement. Other things can help, but there is no replacement. And in the short run, Iran cannot help. The news might help for a few days. The same thing for Venezuela. As for OPEC capacity, we do have, the oil is there. But we have to be very careful talking about this capacity. First, we have to talk about something called the effective spare capacity. Spare capacity is one thing, effective spare capacity is another. Effective spare capacity is anything you can bring almost immediately online. So even if we have, let's say, 3 million barrels a day of spare capacity, or 3.5, not all of it can be brought online immediately. The rest of it needs time. The other problem we have with spare capacity is, and people are missing this point, forget about quantity. The issue here is quality. Crude quality matters. And whatever remaining spare capacity may not be demanded, even if it is there. So the issue really is crude quality, not the quantity in this case. So what the advantage of bringing Iran online is that in few months they can add some of the crude that is desired and required. But if they don't do it, then we are in trouble because of that crude quality.
Okay. Got it. So the second question I want to get to is, how will OPEC respond to the Russia-Ukraine crisis?
I think we already have seen the answer. Their response basically, let me back up here just a minute. Oil is a political commodity. Whether we like it or not, it is a political commodity. So when countries want to make a decision, they have to balance economics and politics at the same time. And that's the trap that OPEC Plus, and specifically the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Kuwait, fell into. That if you look at the economics, especially at the medium term and the long term, they need to increase production because high prices is not good for them. But politically speaking, and here we talk about the oil politics, it's a disaster for them if they increase production above the agreed plan. They have a plan they agreed on last year to increase production every month. And the ceiling of that is 400,000 barrels a day. And they looked at all options, and the ultimate option for them was, okay, if I increase production above that, I can increase production. But if I increase it, I'm going to anger Putin, and Putin is my partner. Russia is part of OPEC Plus, and I don't want to anger Putin. And I don't want to side with Biden either, because Biden basically was shunning them, talking badly about them. Literally, he wants even oil in the United States to be extinct. So it was very clear to them that they need to stick to the plan in this case. People must understand the importance of Russia to the Gulf countries and to OPEC. OPEC has no power in the market more than just lowering volatility on the edges. But that's it. But in the past, when those Gulf countries basically started exporting petrochemicals, the European Union and European countries basically imposed heavy taxes on them, and they really give them a hard time. And for a few years, it was a disaster for them, and they couldn't do anything. Now Russia is there. Russia is a member of the Security Council. Russia is OPEC voice in the Security Council. Why give up that voice? Think about it this way. We had a vote in the Security Council not just 2 months ago on climate change. And if that was adopted, it would have been a crisis for the oil producers all around the world. And Russia stopped them. Russia is the one who is going to stop Europe basically from adopting extreme policies on climate change. Russia is the one who is going to force Europe to not think about extreme carbon taxes. And I'm talking about imports here, imports of products and everything else, etc. So Russia is very important to OPEC Plus. Why give up all of that at this stage? So they have the economics on one side, the politics on one side, and the ultimate outcome of this, just look at it from a game theory point of view, that, okay, I'm going to stick to the plan and I'm going to increase production according to what we agreed on last year.
Okay. So the third question I have is, what will happen if sanctions imposed on Russian oil and natural gas? I kind of want to preface it because some people have been, messaging me, and they're saying, well, we're seeing a little bit of a sell-off here. Are these Russian sanctions really going to play a big role? And I think what people need to take into consideration is right now kind of what's happening in the world. So right now we're seeing large COVID spikes and lockdowns in China, right? So I think case counts rising in Korea as well. There's a lot of fears of potential mobility restrictions. obviously this has an impact on the market. And one thing I think people are failing to realize is I think there's a little bit of confusion when it comes to sanctions on Russian exports. So a lot of people look at loading data, right? I mean, this is a high frequency data, and it shows Russian exports, but it's not showing Russian exports coming off yet. But it's not meant to come off yet. So a lot of this oil right now is oil that's been bought pre-sanctions. So these countries that are receiving oil right now are March loaders. So they're just receiving purchased oil. But then I think later on in this month is when we're really going to see the drop off of Russian oil. That's the question I have for you. So, what do you think these sanctions imposed on Russian oil and natural gas is going to
Let
have?
us look at those sanctions and evaluate what's going on. Let's start with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. He imposed sanctions on Russia, and he literally stopped crude oil imports from Russia. But Canada does not import crude oil from Russia. President Biden said that he imposed sanctions on Russian banks and he kicked them out of SWIFT. Well, he kicked out only small, irrelevant banks. The big banks that matter, nothing happened to them. We already seen the payment that being made yesterday by the Russians using two major American banks. We've seen Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, saying we are going to stop oil imports from Russia, but by the end of the year. We've seen Shell saying we are not going to buy any oil from Russia, and then if you look at the details, what they are saying is we are not going to buy anything from the spot market because most of the buying they do is through contracts. Yet immediately after they announced they are going to stop buying Russian oil, they did buy a whole tanker. And they were exposed, and the CEO had to go public and apologize because of that. You look at BP. BP, as I mentioned earlier, since we talked about the history of Iran, already been suffering there, and they really wanted a way out even before this because they've been squeezed. Shell is the same issue. What happened with Shell is they went to the east, they built the LNG plants, they developed all the gas fields. Once they are done by 2006, Putin and his cronies basically squeezed them almost, and he took 50% of their shares out at that. So they were not able to perform the way they wanted. If you look at the Italian ENI, Total, the French Total, and the Equinor, the Norwegian, what they said. I mean, people think they already kind of stopped their operations in Russia. Well, guess what? All those three companies announced the following: we are going to stop investing in new projects in Russia, which means that it has no impact on anything that's going on at all in Russia. Even if you look at other companies, that non-oil companies like Procter and Gamble said the same thing. McDonald's, they just shut down their operations. They laid off 62,000 workers. And what they said we are closing temporarily. So if you look at everything I said, the sanctions that's been announced is hogwash in a sense. It just kind of, the impact is, it's not biting. Russian oil exports is increasing. And not only that, when Biden announced he is halting imports from Russia, people thought he did. Well, now we know that Russia is exporting more oil to the United States right now because those ships need to reach U.S. ports before April 22nd. But people thought already Biden halted the imports of Russian oil. So we have all kind of games being played with those announcements where the sanctions are not biting.
Okay, so I want to go. I mean, people talk a lot about the U.S. dollar when it comes to oil. So, I mean, the next question I have for you is, looking at OPEC, do you think they're going to, at any point in time, ditch the U.S. dollar and pricing its oil? I've heard you kind of talk about this beforehand. A lot of people bring up crypto and things of this nature as a new way to price oil, but obviously, we look at crypto overall value being around 1.7 trillion and global oil sales being around 2.6 or 2.7 trillion. So I want to ask you, I mean, is there any chance of us ditching the US dollar to go to something else? Because, it's kind of tough looking at this of what would really be a good medium or a good currency to use in this case.
The first point here is we have to distinguish between pricing oil in dollar and between receiving revenues in non-dollar. It is very easy for a country to receive revenues, and they've been doing it for a long time. The issue is pricing oil in dollar. Every barrel of oil in the world is priced in dollar. Before anyone jump and say, well, look at the yuan and look at the Shanghai exchange, and they are using the yuan. Well, if you adjust for the time and adjust for quality, the yuan price is a mirror image of Dubai exchange in dollar. So any way you look at it, oil is priced in dollar. Can countries get the revenues in other currencies? Yes, and they've been doing it for a long time. And here, the second point is, any currency that is needed to price oil has to have three major characteristics. The first one, it has to have liquidity. And the second one, it has to have low volatility relative to other currencies, and it has to be accepted worldwide. So you can see when we talk about crypto, it's not going to fit in this case, at least for now. You look at other currencies, we have another problem. The problem is pricing oil in one currency, whether the dollar or the euro or any other currency, has exactly the same problems. So moving from the dollar does not rescue you if you move to another currency. The other related issue is, what about a basket of currencies? Well, it does not work. And the reason why, because you have 13 OPEC members and they have different trading partners. So if you create a basket, it's going to hurt some and help some. So they are not going to agree onto it because the components are going to affect the real revenues of those countries. So they are not going to agree on that basket anyway. And even if they end up with a basket, managing that basket is extremely expensive. So we are left with the dollar no matter what. That's for the pricing. As for the revenues, they can get it. If Saudi Arabia wants to get its revenues in yuan tomorrow, there is no problem with that. And here I would like to caution, because I know some people went crazy on this yesterday. First of all, there was a denial that it did not happen. Reality, let's face it, probably the story is correct, but it was intended to test the water. And they want to see reaction just before Blinken and other officials from the U.S. landed in Riyadh and before Johnson landed in Riyadh. So probably they try to test the water with it in this case. But even if they do, we are talking about $50 billion a year. What is $50 billion to the U.S. trade alone in dollar? U.S. trade alone in dollar is $5 trillion or more than $5 trillion. So $50 billion is not going to make a big dent in the dollar system. And some people are saying, well, other countries will be encouraged to do it. Well, let's see. And the last point I would like to mention is, because people are making those accusations, and really it reached a level where it needs to stop. Saddam Hussein did not price Iraqi oil in dollar, in euro. So Saddam Hussein did not price Iraqi oil in euro. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya did not price oil in euro. Neither the Iranians nor Maduro or Chavez. What they did is they converted the revenues to non-dollar. Now people are saying because he played with the system, they got killed. Well, look, we had major wars with those guys, and we lost thousands of our best men and women, and we thousands and over 1 million people basically lost their lives in Iraq. And if you add the Gulf War and the Iranian-Iraq War, we are talking about that probably 2.5 million people got killed there. And you are telling me they just killed Saddam Hussein because of he got his revenues in euros. And by the way, the revenues did not exceed $300 million. So let's kind of put an end to those discussions about Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. This is completely irrelevant, but people keep bringing them up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing people have been asking about. I know a lot of people have been talking about climate change. We're talking about oil and the prices rising, but people have been talking about climate change. We're in an era where you see countries like Germany. They had a real nuclear infrastructure that they haven't supported at all, and they've really decided to go with dependency on Russian oil. You've seen the same thing in the United States. And you've seen Vladimir Putin being very assertive in Europe as it relates to ensuring that they're dependent on Russian oil. We've even seen people like easing up on gas taxes and these kinds of things. So, yeah, that's a question a lot of people ask, and I want to pose it to you. What does the future of oil look like in the light of climate change policies?
Demand for oil in the future is going to be higher than any forecast that exists today. And we have a serious problem even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because all those long-term forecasts have some major flaws. And once you adjust for those flaws, you can see that demand for oil and natural gas is going to be way higher. And those flaws basically mostly are related to certain assumptions they made about fuel economy. And when I talk about fuel economy, I'm talking about the gasoline and diesel engines. These are completely nonsense. They are talking about they exaggerated the impact of electric vehicles. Just to give you an example on the exaggeration, they are counting. Cities are converting their buses to electric buses, and they are counting all the buses that's been converted as lost to oil demand. But the problem is, in many cities in the United States and China and other places, those buses were running on CNG, compressed natural gas. So we have problems with the data, and therefore we have problems with the forecast. In this case, those buses are replacing gas; they are not replacing oil. And the list goes on. We don't have time to go through all of those details, but the issue here is we have serious problem with those forecasts even before the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Now we have something new. Putin hit climate change policies really hard. He did not intend to. It just happened. Why? Because we have right now very high fuel prices worldwide, and food prices in many places are at record high. We've seen demonstrations in several poor countries. People are demonstrating against increase in food prices and fuel prices. And we've seen countries, even in Europe and other places, doing two things: providing subsidies. Now, after all these liberalization of markets and globalization, etc., countries are coming back to the old system. They are providing subsidies to their own population so they can keep the population calm and they can keep the peace. On the other hand, they are reducing taxes on fuel to help them. Of course, reducing taxes is going to increase demand in this case, or at least it's not going to destroy demand the same way some people think. But what we see right now is we see countries literally diverting the subsidies from renewable energy and electric vehicles to food and fuel. And therefore, Putin did hit the climate change policies and delayed it probably for the next 7, 8 years. And that delay means higher oil demand and higher demand for natural gas. On the other side, we've seen countries, if you look at Germany and Italy in particular, under the name of or under the guise of national security and energy security, now they are going back to coal. And we are going to see more coal. So literally this, even before the invasion of Ukraine, we have some serious problems with the forecast, and therefore demand is going to be higher. Now, with what Putin did, the demand is going to be even higher than my own forecast.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been kind of saying similar things, but Doctor, I want to get to our last question. Y'all, after this question, I want to open up the floor to some Q&A. I know some people, we have a lot of requests, so bear with me. But, I think the last question here is the future of U.S. shale. So, if can you kind of go into that? This is an area I don't not a lot of people have been talking about, but I mean I've talked to you about this. So, what are your thoughts here as far as U.S. shale goes?
Um, the first thing is let's build on the previous answer. We have a failure of the forecast on one side. We have failure of green policies to materialize the way it was intended, and that means the demand for gasoline in particular is going to be higher. And if demand for gasoline is going to be higher, this is the biggest opportunity for shale right now. Why? Because shale is light crude and you can get a lot of gasoline out of it. And we already have a lot of refineries in the United States that can get it and export it. So when we talk about the future of shale, the failure of forecasts of the International Energy Agency is really good for shale. On the other side, we have kind of a stronger share right now, where the know-how is way better, the technology is better, the management and the efficiencies are better, investors are happier, and everyone is enjoying the cash flow that those companies are generating right now. So, will the U.S. Oil production reach another record high? Yes, and probably faster than what some people think.
Great. Okay, so now I kind of want to open up the floor to some Q&A. We have some speakers up here. So the first person I want to go to is Edward. Edward, go ahead. What do you have for us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound
Yes.
fantastic.
Yeah. All right. So the question that I had was, what are some of the biggest sanctions that would be lifted when the Iran nuclear deal becomes official, and what impact will this have for Iran as well as the oil market?
Okay, so I'll answer this one. I'll do it this way. I'm going to list some of the sanctions being lifted and why they were put in the first place, and that'll kind of give you an idea of what these organizations or what these entities were doing and what they'll probably resume doing once sanctions are lifted if a nuclear deal is signed. So I think some of the biggest ones that come to mind for me are, one sanction in mind is the Supreme Leader's Office Executive Order. So this lifts sanctions on nearly all 112 or 115 people and entities that were sanctioned. So this lifts sanctions on Khamenei's bonyads. Bonyads, basically, they're basically his personal slush funds. So groups like Astan Khudz Razavi, the execution of Khomeini's order. And these basically have billions of dollars that have been confiscated. And these are the kinds of things that were sanctioned because of their illicit funding of the IRGC and other groups. So expect billions of dollars to be put into place, back into play here. A real big one for me is sanctions lifted on 40 entities that support the Islamic Republic and the IRGC. So banks are the big ones here. The three big banks that are having sanctions listed is SEPA Bank. This is a bank that deals with is the financial linchpin of Iran's missile procurement network. So its big ballistic missile program. SEPA Bank is kind of the way that they are able to fund this, and that's why it got sanctioned in the first place. We have Gavamin Bank. This was sanctioned for human rights abuses in 2018 and before that. This is a bank that will have sanctions lifted on it. Central Bank of Iran and National Development. They were sanctioned for pouring billions of dollars into the IRGC, Hezbollah, Quds Force. And so you can imagine if sanctions are listed on these groups, they'll have billions of dollars to start funding those specific groups. Now, the big ones when it comes to oil we've got to talk about here is the NIOC, so the National Iranian Oil Company. Dr. Al-Haji kind of touched on what they do. The NITC, the National Iranian Tanker Company. So these groups were sanctioned for funding Quds Force and the IRGC, and also the NDF, the National Development, the National Development Fund. This is a group that helped fund elements of the IRGC that brazenly struck the Saudi Arabian Aramco oil processing facility in 2019. It took about 5.7 million barrels a day off the market for the Saudis for about a month. And these are the groups that were funding all the groups we talked about. So they were sanctioned for this kind of activity that has nothing to do with the nuclear program, everything to do with Iran's like malign regional activity. So if you think about it, like you asked me what the effect would be, they're going to receive all the funding they had to continue these things. So the last point I'm going to make is the windfall that Iran is going to receive. Iran is going to get the removal of sanctions on the IRGC. As far as cash goes, they're expecting about a $90 billion windfall in foreign exchange reserves, along with prices right now with oil and petrochemical prices. Iran is set to make $50 to $65 billion year after year from these prices, and much more if they go higher. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at as far as the sanctions being lifted. Though there is a lot of groups being sanctioned, and not any of them having to do with Iran's nuclear program. But when these are removed, when we talk about these malign behaviors or these things Iran is engaged with, like expect them to be able to have the funds necessary and to have the shackles of sanctions released to be able to continue doing what they were doing before they were sanctioned. That was a kind of a long-winded answer, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that was really good and whatnot. Yeah, it was longer than what I expected, but it was really thorough and good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, if anybody else has any questions, bring them up. I know I have some in the DMs that I'll go through. But really, I mean, one thing that I think a lot of people are thinking about is the future and how this kind of stuff impacts them personally in the future. But Jason, you have your hand up. We'll get to you. Go ahead, Jason.
Hi, thanks. Really appreciate it. And I could listen to Anas talk to us all night about all of this stuff. So I cover a lot in the cryptocurrency realm, and I kind of wanted to ask a little bit of, while recognizing and completely trusting what you're saying about the lack of commitment to because of the size of the cryptocurrency market today, we do have over 80% of nations looking at ways of doing things like a central bank digital currency. And we are moving toward things that are more digital. And, for Iran, I think it's about 5% of the Bitcoin mining, is produced in that country. So it's been seen as this idea of it could be used to evade cryptocurrency, evade sanctions, right? And it's not big today, but the question is, would it be bigger in the future? And the phenomenon, I think, that's interesting to me that I don't know if you've observed with sort of Ukraine is that they've been accepting a lot of cryptocurrency to help their country. And it's almost like we're seeing this crowdfunding of a war effort, something we haven't seen before. Now, does that mean that, Russian oligarchs and others can also use it, in the other direction? Absolutely. But it seems to me like because it's moving outside the traditional banking system, it's a bit of a game changer, and at some point might affect the hegemony of the dollar unless maybe these CBDCs are created.
Yes. The first idea here is this, that we've seen Iran trying several things during sanctions, including exporting electricity to other countries, because electricity was not included in the sanctions, even in the Obama sanctions. So they kind of focused on everything they can increase revenues. And they even used oil in power plant, literally crude oil, to export electricity because crude was not valuable in some areas, and they were able to make money out of electricity. And the idea here is, with no sanctions, that electricity and that gas that's used to generate electricity is more valuable. So I think that the crypto miners might have some serious problems in Iran on the economics, because Iran is not going to give them the cheap stuff anymore. And the Iranians are really good at that, and they prove to be that way. So I think that the crypto miners in Iran might suffer if Iran opens its economy, simply because we'll start exporting those to other countries, and it will have higher value. In the medium and long term, let's watch the emphasis of the West, especially U.S., on Iranian gas. I think when we talk about Iran in the future, it's Iranian gas that's going to make a difference. Look at Europe right now. What is the problem? Natural gas. So how that Russian gas, or how to reduce Europe dependence on Russian gas? Well, there are several options. Of course, we have the LNG option of the United States. That's already nearing its max right now. So that's gone. The U.S. basically already secured a place in Western Europe for its gas. Where is the additional gas going to come from? Well, the additional gas is going to come from Iran and Nigeria and some from Algeria. Nigeria basically will export the gas through a pipeline that goes through Algeria to Europe. So we might see development of LNG finally. I mean, Iran been trying to develop LNG for the last 25 years. Finally, we might see some development of LNG in Iran. So we might see pipelines. The idea of the old Syrian pipeline could be revived in this case because the old plan was that they will take the Iranian gas. The pipeline will be financed by Qatar. So it's one pipeline, unlike the conspiracy theories that goes about with two pipelines. There is only one pipeline financed by Qatar. It's Iranian gas, and it does not go through the Mediterranean to Europe. It goes to a city in Syria called Homs, which is in central Syria, where it intersects what they call the Arab gas pipeline that's coming from Egypt, and that Arab gas pipeline ends at the border of Turkey today. So the idea was to build this pipeline to Homs in Syria, and then it'll take it to the Turkish border, and then other companies basically will chip in and come in and build the rest of the pipeline to Europe. Russia killed this pipeline, and it also killed the Arab gas pipeline. I think both could be revived, and with the revival of that, I don't think there is room for cryptocurrencies to get some cheap gas or cheap energy as they did in recent years.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really helpful.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jason. We're going to go ahead to Oil God, and anybody else who has questions, either DM them to me, I'll get to some, or raise your hand, come up on speaker, we'll get to you. So, Oil God, I know this guy, so for some of y'all in the room, I know y'all represent Canadian Oil Mafia. This is a group in Canada. They're really big on Canadian oil and really enthusiastic behind the commodity. So, yeah, I have a lot of respect for them. So, Oil God, go ahead.
All hail. Xerxes, really appreciate it. Dr. Anas, a masterclass and a lesson of history on oil, Iran, a friend, both of you, of the Canadian Oil Mafia. I want to applaud you for a fantastic room. Just before I begin with that comment and, of course, some questions.
Thank you.
Dr. Anas, you raised some absolutely fantastic points. The ones I'm going to ask you are obviously going to be, you've got Iran potentially at the 5-yard line, as our friend Xerxes said. If they're at the 5-yard line, we know that there's going to be other nations in the Middle East that obviously are going to do a goal line stance, if you will. I'm going to look at Saudi Arabia. I'm going to look at the Israelis. There's lots of issues, and obviously we don't need to go into why, but the history there. Would love your comments on what you think that would do to the region in terms of stability. And as Xerxes pointed out, the Canadian Oil Mafia, which is here to educate the masses on energy ignorance and what you call energy security. This leads me and all of us to this thesis that, going into this next 10 years, energy security could be one of the biggest disruptions to the world. And so could the United States, dealing with Iran, actually exacerbate this situation, irrespective of the crude quality, which I completely agree with you, that Iran may bring to the table? So I'd like to start there. And Xerxes, I'll come back, of course, at your convenience for more questions. But Dr. Anas, over to you, my friend.
Yes. In the previous session, Xerxes basically and some colleagues basically agreed on the idea that when we talk about Iran, we have to distinguish between Iran as a nation and the current regime. And no one has a problem with Iran as a nation or with the Iranian people, but everyone has a problem with the regime. So we have to make that distinction. And unless the regime changes its behavior and stop exporting the revolution, we might not get the examples that I mentioned about the pipeline and everything else. And therefore, Iran is going to be limited. I think one of the things that we would have seen without this Russian invasion of Ukraine is that Russia was heavily involved in Iran, even in its nuclear program. But my view is that Russians are involved in Iran to control it, which means that they are not going to allow Iran to go above certain number when it comes to oil production, and they are not going to allow it to go above certain number when it comes to natural gas, and may not allow it at all to have LNG. They know Iran is going to be a major, formidable competitor. But unless the regime changes behavior, everything you said is really a big problem. And we don't think that the current situation is going to change much unless we see that change.
Thank you so much.
Right, and I kind of want to chime in on this too. Dr. Anas and myself talked about this at length. And we do think it's really important to distinguish Iran and the Iranian people from the Islamic Republic. But, for the sake of being, credibility, and I owe it to y'all to separate like my emotions from the way I speak about it. So that's the way I'm going to go about it. I think when it comes to Iran, it's important. I think he's absolutely right. He brought up China and China's influence in Iran, Russia's influence in Iran. I think it's important to also bring in China's influence in Iran. So recently we saw China sign a 25-year deal with Iran. And this deal basically included the cheap oil sales of Iran to China. And in exchange was $400 billion, but really what it's going to be is investment into Iran. Iran desperately needs investment. So $280 billion of these, $200 billion is going towards the development of Iranian oil fields, which are severely underdeveloped relative to its Saudi and Emirati and Qatari partners in the region, or rivals in the region. And $120 billion is going to go through transportation and manufacturing development. You bring up, the goal line stance that these other countries are going to be having when it comes to Iran. Yeah, I think this is absolutely right. I think when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, I know a lot of Iranians in this room and a lot of Iranians in general don't want any sort of negotiation with the Islamic Republic. But at the end of the day, it's not up to us. And I think what it comes down to is the Americans in the West sees Iran on the precipice of acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that's all they see. They've got tunnel vision. So unfortunately, the wishes of the Iranian people are just not something they're thinking of. So if you're buying what I'm selling so far, understand that this deal has a high likelihood of going through just because of that alone. And I think when you think about this, I don't think the Saudis or the Emiratis hate the nuclear deal. I think they like the nuclear deal. I think what they hate is the idea of an Iran that is open to dealing with the West, allowed to have global trade with the world. Because in this instance, if you're sitting in Saudi Arabia and you're looking at the geopolitical map of the world, you see an Iran with 85 million people, very well educated, 70% of the population under the age of 45, and a robust economy, and the second largest natural gas reserves in the world, fourth largest oil reserves in the world. And this is a country that has been really held down and suppressed because of really its own malign activity in the region that has resulted in sanctions. But yeah, the sanctions have really played a big role in this. But they've earned it. The Islamic Republic has earned the sanctions. But so I think they see these things, and I don't think it's that they hate the nuclear deal. I think it's that they hate these sort of things that would allow Iran to kind of open up and be a big player. A lot of experts see that in the next 6 to 8 months, Iran could replace Russian oil production on the market. So understand that there could be a major player in this industry, and I think a lot of Gulf countries understand this. So we'll see where it goes from there. But I don't think, as far as they're saying it, I don't think they have one. I think at this point in time, they're willing to work with it. This is a region. It's tough it's a tough neighborhood, but I think everybody in their own interest, they're going to work together more than they're going to fight each other at this point. I think a lot of
Let me add one more point, because I think this is a significant point. The problem is every group and every country is trying to take advantage of the situation. And for the United States, basically, they are trying to tell the Gulf nations, okay, don't worry about Iran if we have a nuclear deal, because we can give you, you can buy the shield from us that will protect you. So all of a sudden, they are trying really to milk those nations for nothing. And I heard this from a senior official in the Gulf. He said, I would rather go for a 2-year war where the capabilities of Iran are destroyed, rather than to live all my life under the shield, the American shield. So in a sense, it's not only the issue of Iran and the behavior of Iran, it's the behavior of others too who are trying to take advantage of the situation.
Dr. Anas, may I ask one follow-up question to both you and Xerxes, whichever one wants to answer? This offensive, 5-yard line with the Iranians is now with the Democrats. It's very, very difficult for me, and I'm not a politician, to see the Democrats remaining in power. How do you feel the Republicans would do, just given we have hardliners in Iran that don't want this deal, and we have Republicans that have obviously kiboshed this deal? Over to you, maybe Xerxes.
Yeah, I'll answer first. First of all, I think it's really important that we understand a big failure of Western policy towards Iran is believing in this false dichotomy between moderates and hardliners in Iran. Um, they are both the same thing. These are both hardline elements in Iran. A big problem with the way the West has approached Iran is they've really tried to empower the moderates within Iran, or the quote unquote moderates, right? So I'll give you an example of this. So during nuclear negotiations under the Rouhani administration, the previous administration, the EU foiled a Islamic Republic terror plot in Europe, and when they pushed to go through sanctions, they actually backed off because their strategy was to empower the Rouhani administration, which was viewed as a moderate administration. Ultimately, we found out that this was not a moderate administration, but we trick ourselves into this false dichotomy between there's two groups, rival groups in Iran, the moderates and the hardliners. And this is just a false dichotomy. They're both hardline republic. They both represent the same thing. So I think, the way the Democrats have gone about it, I think they've really tried to, they've really been keen on empowering this. And what we've seen from more conservative elements is they don't really mess around with this at all. So when you see their rhetoric, you see the way they approach it, they're ready to tear up any deal with Iran because they see in Iran that, there is no moderate or hardliner. They're both hardline. So I think this is a really good point you bring up. And I think it's one we need to start understanding when we look at Iran and the way foreign policy has been crafted to deal with this country, because it's been crafted off of this false dichotomy of moderate and hardliner, and we're going to empower the moderates to become more powerful and make Iran more liberal. And unfortunately, this is just not a reality. And I think a lot of people are waking up to it. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, everything goes out the window because it's such a serious issue. We're talking about a nuclear weapon, and when we're talking about a nuclear weapon, everything goes out the window. How you feel about the regime, the wishes of the Iranian people, none of this is taken into consideration. The goal here is to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. I think the world can agree that we don't want a regime like this getting that, and that's kind of been driving policy. So they have tunnel vision when it comes to this. All else goes out the window. And Dr. Nas, if you want to kind of chime in on this, you can. Otherwise, I think
no comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. Shubham, we'll go to you, and then Terrence. Go ahead, Shubham.
Yeah, you betcha. Thanks for having me. I know we've had these discussions a bit, and thank you again, Xerxes and Dr. Anas for hosting this. So I don't really have a question, but I have a comment here. So we see a lot of misleading and manipulation in the media of the general public. I'm seeing all sorts of nonsense on Twitter, on Instagram, on the media about the oil companies are selling gasoline and they're doing this and doing that. So I just want to say that I thank all of you for hosting these rooms, giving out real information, some of the statistics, some of the data that I think the investors and just people involved in the industry anyway are tired of hearing all this misleading information, especially from the government. They're taking advantage of oil price spiking. Well, then it's the big bad oil companies, right? So this whole mentality, this whole mantra that's being spread, I think needs to be addressed in a way. And the oil industry has not fought for themselves for a long, long time. But I think rooms like this, we have 500 people here, and then we spread some information, and then that goes to slowly disseminate it through the general public. I think is doing a really good job, and I see more and more comments calling out the administration on lying and straight up misleading on some of their comments. So thank you again, Doctor, and thank you again, Xerxes, for hosting. And I see Prodigal on here. I see Dr. Aziz. I see Attaqa and Oil God and the Canadian Oil Mafia here. I think we all have the same goal here, and it's to get rid of energy ignorance. And from everyone here, I thank you for all the work you're doing.
Of course.
Thank you. You reminded me of a story that is relevant to the history that I mentioned about Iran. that when Mohammed Mossadegh nationalized the oil in 1951, the British and the British media basically was going around the world talking about the stolen oil. And you can imagine the propaganda at that time about the stolen oil. And you can read articles that are, you can see the propaganda in them. And then Mohammed Mossadegh himself is a lawyer. He himself, as a prime minister, he represented his country in the international court. And he argued that Iran has the right to nationalize that oil. Despite all the media and all the propaganda, he succeeded in court. And he was able to win the case for Iran. So it took knowledge on one side and courage on the other. So despite all the propaganda, he was able to succeed. And the idea was very simple. Under international law, when the British signed the agreement with the Shah, the British were occupying Iran. And under international law, no occupier can sign long-term contracts. And that contract was signed under duress, and therefore it violates international law, and he won. So to confirm your point that, yeah, despite all the propaganda, it takes knowledge and courage to win.
Thanks for that, Doctor. We're going to go to Terrence, and anybody else on stage who has some questions, let me know. Otherwise, let me know in the DMs and we'll get to it. Go ahead, Terrence.
Great. Thank you very much. Anas, big fan. Question for you. How much do you think the current U.S. policy is centered around, or continues to be centered around, not letting global leaders or leaders of oil-producing nations go off the petrodollar? So some people think that the U.S. took out Saddam Hussein and the leader of Libya because they threatened to go off the petrodollar. Do you see that continuing? Is there any truth to that? And any thoughts on that?
A couple of things here. First of all, if you look at Saddam Hussein, for example, you look at Muammar Gaddafi, they've been embargoed. There are sanctions on them. So they have no use of the dollar no matter what. So for us at that time, it was very clear they have no other choice but to do this. So they kind of looked like powerful men in front of their population, but that's it. The U.S. was not even bothered. It was the U.S. who literally agreed to convert Saddam Hussein's dollars to euro. So that has it does not bother them at all to do that. And this happens all the time. The issue for the United States basically is the pricing. And no matter whatever we do under the current conditions, there is no replacement for the dollar. Now, there is a case to be made that if a producer like Russia decides to switch, I'm not talking about the pricing here, I'm talking about revenues. Say, okay, I export 6 million barrels a day, and I want all my revenues in non-dollar. So now we have both sides. We have China, for example, on one side as a buyer, and we have a major producer basically accepting other currencies. If this becomes very large and becomes trendy, then that will cause some problems to the system. But we got to remember that we are talking about 2.6, like Xerxes mentioned earlier. We're talking about $2.6 trillion oil trade. So how much of it has to be in non-dollar to have an impact? I don't know. Probably someone can do some modeling and end up with some results. But definitely it has to be big and bigger than the 6 million barrels of Russia or others.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Doctor. All right, next we're going to go to my friend Prodigal. Prodigal, go ahead. What do you have for us?
Yeah, I just wanted to step in geopolitically. I mean, for Gaddafi in Libya, there's whispers, right? You've seen the WikiLeaks release where there was talk of him potentially making a Pan-African currency based on gold. And we all know that the French have an outsized influence on the African markets. But I mean, it's all whispers. The issue with Libya is that it further eroded Western credibility, right? If you look at what Gaddafi did post Iraq was he said, okay, I'll give up, I'll comply. And then essentially what the U.S. did was act as an air force for a lot of in a civil war with elements that were related to Islamic extremists and terrorists. So I just think, when you look at it geopolitically, that's something to consider. And the only other thing I'll say is, the issue is not whether it's just going to be oil, right? We're seeing a lot of countries, even potential allies, say, well, we're going to have to do some trade of other goods in another denomination. You're seeing that increasingly with India in regards to its need of fertilizer. You saw that with Pakistan, where its leader actually went to Russia on the day of invasion and was basically harassed via the news. And his response was, we need Russian fertilizer, we need Russian wheat. So there are fractures. Even if you look at Israel, it's been hedging its bets in addition to Mexico, in addition to Turkey. So the issue isn't, well, is it only going to be oil, right? It's not going to be an overnight replacement, right? The reserve currency and the denominated trade is not going to change overnight. The issue is, are they going to be able to establish a foothold and become an alternative that can grow over the years? And then when you look at that geopolitically down the line, is this going to be affected now with countries having to skirt sanctions against Russia for need of their nickel, for need of their aluminum, for need of their gas, for need of their oil? And is this also going to be affected now with China becoming more assertive, as you've seen with its accusations regarding biolabs, as you've seen with its announcement on February 4th regarding basically a new counter to the West? And if China starts pressuring a lot of these countries, it's trapped in debt diplomacy to start paying back debt denominated in dollars and in yuan. So, I mean, this is what the issue when we talk about the reserve currency.
Right.
I understand the petrodollar props everything up. That's what it's based on. But
Yes,
right now, yeah.
a couple of points here. The first one is I am completely convinced, based on some work I've done, it's not finished, but that adding those currencies, especially in recent years, to the world trade led to some stabilization and stability in the financial system and in trade. But you are right. The issue is, if it expands, it is very clear theoretically that there is a threshold. If they cross it, then there are problems. And I'm not talking only about political problems, because it seems that the dominance of one currency is important to that stability, just like in a cartel when you have a major producer who is kind of running the things.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll say is that, the issue I look at it from an American-centric approach is that, this is going to make financing and accumulating more debt very, very hard, right? There's been, it's already, if you look at increased commodities and budgets and what's COVID wrecked, et cetera, it's not something that the West can stomach. You're seeing it now with Italy, where its finances are actually worse than during the Great Recession. This is, you're going to see a central bank policy at a time of needed tightening, whether they can do it with inflation, energy, and food costs just skyrocketing. So, I'll end it on that.
But let me tell you the second point, because it is related. The second point here is those countries that switched or tried to switch, all of them have sanctions imposed on them. And if you look at the circumstances, if there are no sanctions, what will they use? It seems that the switching is profitable as long as the sanctions are on, but not in a free market. And the idea here is, in a free market without any sanctions, will we see the same trend? I don't know the answer, but I think this is a legitimate question.
Yeah, and I also want to add, I think he brought up a good point that, I'll pose this as a question to you, Doctor. So it seems like he brought up the yuan and pricing it and different things. What is the possibility of a new system? So we see the possibility of Russia moving to sell crude on a Chinese exchange. And, we've heard that the Saudis considering, allowing purchases in the yuan. So I know the Russians, if they're going to do this, they can do this, but they need the Gulf countries like the Saudis, the UAE, the Qataris to buy in. What are the chances of this kind of a pivot to a new system?
There are a couple of points when we talk about this. First of all, I don't think the Chinese want any other nation dominating in their own exchanges. If major oil producers go to the exchange and they start selling their oil, it is a major change, and it is going to impact several things, including the pricing itself, which means that we are going to have some arbitrage going on around the world. But generally speaking, China is not going to allow others to have any control in those exchanges, and it's allowing just those companies and trading houses basically get involved. But the idea that major oil producers switching is a serious idea. But again, will it be successful in a free market without any sanctions or political problems? I don't know.
Okay, so we're going to go to Oil God. Oil God, what do you have for us?
Thank you, Xerxes. And Dr. Anas, a two-part question. You can take it whichever way you'd like. And this actually stems from your earlier comment that in the decades ahead, the forecast for oil demand is going to exceed current present-day expectations, which obviously, I would 100% wholeheartedly agree with you. The nations in the world today that produce, the nations in the world today that are pivoting from producing. Can you walk us through what nations are going to benefit over the coming decades of this higher oil demand? That's question number one. And then the second question I have for you, because I obviously live in a country where our political leaders belong in the circus. Can you help the people in this room understand how places like Saudi Arabia, that have majority of the kingdom's revenues derived from oil, how they're also pivoting while they're producing oil? Can you help to educate us like what the strategy is when you're oil rich and you actually know how to manage that and what to do with it? I'm just going to take a bunch of notes and then hopefully draw some, cartoon pictures, and I'll send it over to Justin Trudeau. Over to you.
uh, Generally speaking, when we talk about who is going to benefit the most in the future, first of all, we do not have, if you look at the next 10, 15 years, we do not have enough oil to meet demand, which means that we are going to have shortages and we are going to have energy crisis no matter what. Any way you look at it, we are going to have energy crisis. Countries that will benefit, of course, we have two types. The ones that are going to benefit from the price, those, especially those who can sell in the spot market rather than the contracts. But countries like Saudi Arabia, when everyone stopped investing, Saudis were investing, and Saudis are going for a total capacity above 13 million barrels a day. So they are going to benefit greatly at that time. If Iran, if the sanctions are lifted on Iran and Iran get the foreign investment and we end up with a stable regime that is accepted worldwide, they are going to benefit greatly, because I can see Iran basically going to about 5 million barrels a day, and they can contribute. Venezuela is questionable. There are too many issues with Venezuela in this case. But let's not forget about natural gas. The biggest story of the future is really natural gas. It's way bigger than oil, simply because everyone is going to find out, if you want to have energy security and environmental security at the same time, it's natural gas. You have no other choice but that. And natural gas is going to be very big. And that's where many countries will come to play, from all the way from Latin America to the North Sea.
I want to also chime in on this. I think you brought up a good question about what does it look like, in the future for these countries that derive a lot of their revenue from oil. I think Saudi is a really good example of this. So Saudi understands their position very well. If you've seen, one thing that's been brought up is Vision 2030. This is an effort led by a really aggressive crown prince in Mohammed bin Salman, and it's somebody who really recognizes Saudi's position right now, and they're really trying to gear towards the future. So a few areas to really look for when it comes to Saudi Arabia is the tourism sector. They're investing heavily in this. They see what's happening in the UAE. They see the kind of revenue that's at stake there, and they're really gearing up for this, a diversified economy, because you need it ultimately. When you're a one-trick pony, the way we've seen some of these countries, things can go really south for you if that demand falls off. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but the Saudis are really preparing themselves in a really serious way. So I urge everybody to look into some of these projects they have going on. A lot of it is based off of a tourism industry, But I think tech is an area where they're really investing in heavily. So they're taking a lot of these oil revenues and they're putting it into diversifying their economy because I think they see the future, they understand the future. It's not that they don't think oil is going to be in play. Oil is absolutely going to be in play, but they understand that it just can't be a one-trick pony. And yeah, good on them. I think it's great strategy to plan for the future. So we'll see what happens. We'll go Jason and then Prodigal. Jason, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. One thing that's interesting with what you've explained about the trajectory for oil and the increase that we're going to see and the impact about the energy prices. One thing that has influenced the world for quite a while is this idea of the dollar as the reserve currency as a result of the oil. And one thing that's interesting is as things go on, if this is the case and oil continues to be in high demand and the increase goes up, how do you think that affects the use of the dollar, the impact to the United States? Does it mean they still stay in that pull position? And what are the opportunities now really with sort of this close alliance we're seeing between Russia, Iran, and perhaps China with the Silk Road of developing another currency to possibly replace that? Obviously not by next year, but if we are going to see oil be a constant, what do you think that will do to the nation state currencies?
Generally speaking, if you look at the experience of those countries, we do have an alliance between Russia, China, and Iran and Turkey. And you look at their experiences trading together. They tried everything. They have an agreement to trade in national currencies, and they got burned, especially because of the decline of the rial and the decline of the lira. They tried crypto, it did not work. They tried gold and they tried barter deals. Nothing worked. What worked for them basically perfectly was the euro. So the euro basically worked. So the idea here is among all the alternatives that exist, and we have many, it's very clear that still currencies like the dollar and the euro, they are still kings. But even if you go to the Iranians today, and the Iranians have, the Iranian regime has thousands of shell companies around the world, basically to funnel the money back to the regime. And if you give them, and not only them, basically, even you look at smugglers around Turkey or other places, you give them a choice of any currency, okay? And first one, the dollar. In some places in Turkey, basically, just because of the proximity to EU and this stuff, their choice basically is euro. But as you go farther east, they ask for the dollar, despite all the other choices. The dollar is still king, despite all those things that we talk about.
Great. So we're going to go to Prodigal. Prodigal, go ahead.
Yeah, just to touch on your point, Xerxes. I mean, we've all heard rumbles that Saudi Arabia is going to basically carve off Medina and Mecca into basically an autonomous religious state and modernize the rest of the country. You've seen them recently raising capital, selling pipelines, etc. So, it remains to be seen. Saudi Arabia is going to chart its own course. You've seen overtures. They've even shared intelligence with Israel on some occasions. So, especially with Iran's rising, the question is, what are the Gulf states going to do? And, at least what we're seeing out of Israel is that this new deal might be so bad that they may move regardless on their own if it's signed. Then the question is, like Anas brought up, is whether who and which Arab states will join in this. So, I mean, even if Ukraine, hopefully a ceasefire occurs, the Iranian deal could potentially lead to basically a regional conflict in the Middle East, where a number of parties may stay on the sidelines. The U.S., I don't know what it would do. Russia and China might just sit and watch, since they all have made overtures to both sides. And I would love to hear what Anas thinks on the possibility of conflict erupting after the Iranian deal, and what the world powers in regards to the U.S., Russia, and China would do, since they have increasing relationships with all these the Gulf states and Iran.
I'm sure there are people who can have better answers in this group right now on the political side, but I have a history lesson that I learned the hard way, and I would like to share it with all of you. No one ever expected Sadat, the president of Egypt, will go and visit Israel and sign a peace accord that still stands until today. No one expected the UAE will sign an agreement with Israel. No one expected that Hosni Mubarak, the powerful man, will just leave his post at all. No one expected Muammar al-Qaddafi or the end of Muammar al-Qaddafi the way it ended. No one expected the fall of the Shah in 1979 or in 1951. No one expected Saddam Hussein will end the way he ended. So if you look at all those events in recent history in the Middle East, everything is possible. That's what the history is telling us.
I also want to add on that. I think that's what's so interesting about covering the Middle East too, is that you really never know what's going to happen. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I've been following the Iran nuclear deal, and like everybody looks at it and they know we're on the 5-yard line. It looks like all sides are ready to engage in signing this thing. And then just this last weekend, we have Iran launching a ballistic missile strike on Israeli assets and potentially U.S. assets. So it's a tinderbox. You never know which way things are going to go, Prodigal. I understand this. We're speaking from the perspective that we think it's going to go through. If that happens, well, then Iran has a lot to gain from it. The Islamic Republic does. But the problem with it is, you never know how the region is going to react, because making this deal, people believe that it's the kind of deal that's going to make of a calmer Iran, an Iran that reduces its activities across the Middle East. And we didn't see that the last time around.
But they're negotiating Iran's support of its proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas after the deal, correct? So, I mean, it sort of removes the leverage of them diminishing their regional activities if they're going to get, this type of, one shot of income into a sanction-riddled economy, right? It just in my vision, I think that seems to be the concern of Israel and a number of the Gulf states, right? You're leaving this part that is instrumental to their own national security till after you deal with your own energy security needs. And that's why I think it's very, in my opinion, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's a possibility.
Right. No, I completely understand what you're saying. And I think, this deal specifically, like what's in the text, like what we understand from it is that this is meant to address the nuclear issue specifically. And then after, there's supposed to be additional talks that address the regional activities of Iran. Now, whether that changes or not, I'm skeptical, but that's the way it is going to be. I mean, this is a deal built off of mistrust on both sides, on all sides. This is not a deal made in trust of that these are people that expect each other to do the right thing. It was made in mistrust. So there's a lot of checks that's going to be taking place. So this is why this region is so fascinating. This is why it's so important to cover it, because things are changing. There's a lot of moving parts, and they're moving very quickly all the time. Just this last weekend, I did a space, and where Iran had attacked assets in Erbil, and we took this as a sign of a nuclear deal collapse. So understand, if you're buying what I'm selling so far, understand that things are very delicate in this region. And if I was to predict and gamble on what was going to happen, I would be losing a lot of money. So all we can do is speculate and deal with what's in front of us. And right now we have a nuclear deal. We believe that's going to get signed. And we're going to see what happens there. If Iran engages in the same kind of nefarious activity it's done, who knows what that's going to lead to. You're absolutely right. It's an open book. We're going to see what happens. So we're going to go to Shahram next. You've had your hand up. Shahram, go ahead.
Hello, Xerxes. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you sound fantastic.
Awesome. Okay, so I just had a question, regarding the future, because I briefly heard you guys talk about it before, but to frame my question better, during Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah's era, they both wanted to focus on reducing Iran as like an oil economy, not necessarily getting rid of it, but adding alternatives long term for Iran. Do you see, like, with this current regime, that they would have like a plan B if oil doesn't work out long term for them? Well, inevitably it won't, but do you think they have like a plan B for the long term as far as the economy?
Doctor, do you want to take that one?
Yes, they don't. But we should not underestimate their abilities because, yes, a lot of people may not like the regime, but they were very successful in many efforts. For example, there was a time, remember when we talked about Abadan refinery was the largest one in the world, and then it was destroyed during the Iraq-Iran war, and that forced Iran to import gasoline. So when the tension started between Europe, the US on one side, and Iran on the other, they imposed sanctions, and the sanctions did not work. And all of a sudden, they found out that Iran imports a lot of gasoline. And that was Iran's weakest link. So the late Senator McCain, if I recall correctly, gave a speech and he requested that sanctions be imposed on Iran so Iran cannot import gasoline. Ahmadinejad was the president at that time, and they adopted the policy. The success of that policy was amazing to the extent that it could be used as a textbook for other countries. What they did basically immediately, they switched taxis and other cars in big cities to CNG, and they have a lot of it. And at the same time, they start building those miniature refineries because to get gasoline from light crude is very easy. So they built those several refineries quickly. And all of a sudden, Iran became an exporter of gasoline. And right now, Iran exports gasoline to Iraq. So if you look at stories like this, it seems that the regime with the human resources that exist in Iran, which is, by the way, an incredible, even historically, if you look at it, Iran has an incredible human resource base and expertise almost in everything. And they were able to do it. And this event was, I mean, there is no other country in the world was able to do what Iran did with gasoline. So the idea here is if they really want to do something, they can, because they have the political will on one side and they have the human resources to do it. But as we speak, they have no plan.
Thanks for that, Doctor. Okay, I think Shima, you've been wanting to talk. I haven't seen your hand, but I know you've been messaging me. Shima, do you have a question that you want to add? And then we'll go to Kumar. Go ahead, Shima.
I had a question somebody wanted me to ask, but it was answered during the Q&A about Russia and China taking over in Iran and their deal with Iran. But I want to talk about three issues. One was about today's the RNC, the Republican research, basically, committee. They announced, and they typed actually in Farsi, a tweet that says, the tweet is in Farsi, so I'm going to translate it. That says, we, the 52 Republican representative, we are warning Biden administration that if this they're giving any guarantee to Putin and they're going to lift non-nuclear sanctions, we're going to be against that, and we will again impose our own maximum pressure. We're going to stand by the people of Iran, and we're going to stand against the regime. So somebody, I think, asked about the Republican roles, and this is what they typed today in Persian, actually. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that somebody asked what is going to happen if the sanctions are removed. I want to emphasize that during Ahmadinejad's presidency from 2005 to 2013, the IRGC, the military sector of Iran, expanded its role, established its role deeply in the economy. It wasn't the case as much before Ahmadinejad, and during Ahmadinejad, remember that it was the oil price really went high, and a lot of money came to the country. And at the time, Iran was sanctioned, but there were this Porsche and all these cars, expensive cars, were importing into country while people could not have access to other things. And you're talking about an IRGC that is military-wise is very dangerous. The ideology is very dangerous. And
and we have which is, by the way, an incredible, even historically, if you look at it, Iran has an incredible human resource base and expertise almost in everything. And they were able to do it. And this event was, I mean, there is no other country in the world was able to do what Iran did with gasoline. So the idea here is, if they really want to do something, they can, because they have the political will on one side and they have the human resources to do it. But as we speak, they have no plan.
Thanks for that, Doctor. Okay, I think Shima, you've been wanting to talk. I haven't seen your hand, but I know you've been messaging me. Shima, do you have a question that you want to add? And then we'll go to Kumar. Go ahead, Shima.
I had a question somebody wanted me to ask, but it was answered during the Q&A about Russia and China taking over in Iran and their deal with Iran. But I want to talk about three issues. One was about today's the RNC, the Republican research, basically, committee. They announced, and they typed actually in Farsi, a tweet that says, the tweet is in Farsi, so I'm going to translate it. That says, we, the 52 Republican representative, we are warning Biden administration that if this they're giving any guarantee to Putin and they're going to lift non-nuclear sanctions, we're going to be against that, and we will again impose our own maximum pressure. We're going to stand by the people of Iran, and we're going to stand against the regime. So somebody, I think, asked about the Republican roles, and this is what they typed today in Persian, actually. The second thing I wanted to talk about is that somebody asked what is going to happen if the sanctions are removed. I want to emphasize that during Ahmadinejad's presidency from 2005 to 2013, the IRGC, the military sector of Iran, expanded its role, established its role deeply in the economy. It wasn't the case as much before Ahmadinejad, and during Ahmadinejad, I remember that it was the oil price really went high, and a lot of money came to the country. And at the time, Iran was sanctioned, but there were this Porsche and all these cars, expensive cars, were importing into country, while people could not have access to other things. And you're talking about an IRGC that is military-wise is very dangerous. The ideology is very dangerous, and if they gain more power, because the whole economy in Iran is 80% state economy. I know it's very hard to understand for probably Westerners, especially my friends and compatriots in the U.S., but the economy is run state-run economy. So the money comes in, it goes through the state, by the state, it's everything by the state. So, and you have a state right now that IRGC is embedded in every aspect of it, and you cannot do anything about it. And their power is just going to be rising up more and more if the sanctions are removed. The last thing I wanted to say, and I'm going to finish this, because I see a lot of people keep constantly saying the coup, the coup, the coup. This is from the book, All the Shah's Men, that I know Stephen Kinzer has sold this book, and a lot of people might have read it, some may not. But the coup and this whole oil nationalization of oil didn't start with Mossadegh. It started with Reza Shah. And as much as Kinzer wanted to diminish the role of Reza Shah and want to patronize him, he could not get rid of the facts. And I'm going to read from the page 51, A Wave of Oil chapter, because Reza Shah notified Anglo-Saxon Persian company that he has canceled the Darcy concession. The Darcy concession was the main contract, that a British contract that was basically extracting oil from Iran and wouldn't give any fair share to the. So he canceled that, and this is happening in 1932. So basically, the Darcy concession was reduced by 3/4. Iran was guaranteed payment of at least 975,000 annually, and in the euro, and at the time probably the pound. And the company agreed to improve working condition at Abadan. So it didn't start with Mossadegh. Please do not go with this story of coup. One thing after regime change hopefully happens is that we're going to have to wash off everything that the Western academia wrote about Iran's history and everything about the coup of Mossadegh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shima John. All right, we're going to go to Kumar next. Go ahead, Kumar.
Hey, Dr. Anas, I had a question. Will countries start developing more indigenous refineries? Because, like, I know, I know oil less well than I know natural gas, but There's different flavors of oil. They have to be processed by different types of refineries. Will more and more countries start developing those refineries in-house in the US? I mean, are they going to forward invest in refineries so we can import and export from more locations? Or more countries going to do that? Or, where does that sit? And maybe this is a dumb question. I'm more on natural gas, as you know.
Yes, we are. If we look at the future, we are going to have more competition in refined products than crude. And that's for several reasons. The first reason is many countries are restricting investment in refining because of climate change policies. So we are going to see other countries basically compensating by building those refineries. So we are going to see more concentration of refineries than before. And most of them basically will be in the oil producing countries, or in some countries like China and India. But let's remember the following. The issue of climate change is not only limiting the building of refining capacities in Europe and the United States. It's leading to other factors too. Oil producers are reacting to that. And one of the policies of the oil producers basically is the following. You can sum it up in the way I'm going to say it right now. That, okay, you don't want my oil and gas, and you want to switch to electricity, and you want to switch to electric vehicles, go ahead. I want to make sure that the body of the car and most of the car is built by my own oil and gas. You don't want my oil and gas, and you want to build wind power. That's fine. I want to make sure that those turbines and those blades are made from my oil and gas. The same thing for solar and anything else. So the idea here is those countries are going to move to exporting oil embedded in something else. And therefore, you are going to see more refining, more petrochemicals, more oil to materials in those countries. So the refining basically is the refining sector is only one small part of the puzzle of the future, because those countries are going to behave that way. My problem is if those countries are going that way and demand is going to increase above expectations, where the crude is going to come from. That's where the energy crisis is going to hit.
Another question I got that's just a follow-on. Sorry. Do you think the U.S. will ever ease its regulations on consumptions of our own indigenous natural gas? I've brought up the issue of it costs 5 to 7 times the cost to convert your vehicle to CNG, and it's 50x to 100 times the cost to put up a CNG station in the U.S. as to Nigeria or Bangladesh or any developing country. Do you think that will ever change in the U.S. So that consumers can run cars on CNG?
Not in the U.S. and not with the large lobby of LNG right now. But you mentioned Bangladesh and other nations. Other nations, the poorer nations, are switching. If you look at a country like Egypt, for example, it has an amazing program to switch to natural gas, to switch its cars and fleet to natural gas. And so it's not electric, it's natural gas. And those countries basically are finding it way better because they can go to climate change negotiations and show that they did reduce CO2 emissions even more than the industrial countries, and yet they achieved energy security too.
Can you explain that LNG lobby bit? It's something that I think I don't know about. I just see the constraint, and it doesn't make.
Well, with the size and the importance of the LNG industry right now, their lobby is getting bigger and more powerful. And we've seen Trump basically being the kind of master marketer of LNG during his presidency. And now we've seen Biden basically being the effective marketer of LNG. So they have an extremely powerful lobby that will prevent the use of CNG within the United States or expanding the CNG because it's going to increase their cost. And some of the guys will go to it instead of going to LNG.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Kumar. Another member from, you're not part of the Canadian oil mafia, but I see you all the time. You're, really enthusiastic about the commodity. So I always love having y'all on. The last question I want to have, and then we're probably going to wrap this up, get out of here. We have a hard stop at 9. somebody asked me, ask Dr. Al-Haji, in the future, what does oil look like to you? Is this going to be part of the energy mix? How relevant is this going to be? How important is this going to be? And then we're going to wrap it up with some final comments. We're going to get out of here. Go ahead, Doctor.
Okay. As I said, the demand for oil and gas is going to be way higher than all forecasts. And with the Russian-Ukraine crisis, is going to be even higher than that. We are going to end up with what I call energy cocktail. Every country is going to have this. Countries that are going to choose the renewable energy as strategic investment rather than kind of a belief or a dogma, they are going to succeed. Because if you look at any country in the world, you can see that there are places where the renewable energy is the best no matter what. Simply because they are far away, simply because it takes a lot of time and efforts and cost to transport oil or gas or coal or anything else to it. A lot of people do not know this, that the number one country in the world in renewable energy historically was Cuba, was way ahead of Europe, way ahead of the United States, and then it died down. And what they did, if you look at their stories, they did an amazing things, because the way they did renewable energy, they really focused on remote places, and it was very successful. And if you look at wind and solar in Saudi Arabia, basically that's what they are doing. They are choosing the places carefully. And with choosing the places carefully, you have value added to that. So we are going to end up with every country is going to have kind of a cocktail of energy, and some of the energy sources will be dominant. But the idea that we are going to be we are going to get rid of oil and gas, as some people are thinking, this is not the case. All the evidence point to exactly the opposite.
Great, I appreciate it. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. So, I retweeted the link on my page. I want everybody who has questions for any comments on the next space I do with Dr. Al-Haji. If you have any questions or things you want to bring up or any comments, please put it under that one. But I'm getting overwhelming DMs in my space. Dr. Al-Haji, I appreciate you coming on. You put on an absolute masterclass for our audience, and everybody here should go and follow him. He's really insightful when it comes to this industry, and I think in the near future we're going to have a lot of news that you're going to want to see him chime in on if you want a really accurate person that understands what they're talking about when it comes to this. But any final comments from you, Doctor, before we get out of here?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much. I mean, your experience and knowledge of the Iran and the region is amazing. So thank you very much. And I would like to thank my colleagues at Attaqa, who was the co-sponsor of this, and they are doing an amazing job. For those who do not know, basically Attaqa is the main energy media outlet in Arabic. And if you see any tweets from Attaqa or from me, please use that translation button. The translation button basically is very helpful, because you can get it in any language you are using and understand what's going on. And the translation is really good in this case. I would like just to direct a comment to Shema, and I heard this comment before. We don't have to be really emotional about Mossadegh and the Shah, in this case, who did this, and whether academics and we need to scrap this and all that stuff. This is history, and we have those discussions about history all over the world, and there are all kind of opinions, all kind of things, etc. And I could be wrong about what I said, and everyone else could be right. This is so. What I'm trying to say here is we are here to spread knowledge, and if some of that is not correct, thank you for correcting that. But we don't have to get emotional about it. Thank you very much, all, and Xerxes, really thank you. That was amazing. Thank you.
No, thank you. And like I said, please go follow Attaqa and Dr. Al-Haji. They're excellent when it comes to this stuff. and I've got like 65 DMs in my request right now. Just to send those or whatever comments you had to the link of the space. It'll be a recording. Just post that, and we're going to try to get together and do something in the future. But I appreciate everyone coming out tonight, and none of this would be possible without Dr. Al-Haji and all the speakers we have. So thanks again, y'all, and have a good night. We'll see you next time.